Hello everyone, this is Sumit Bose and I am from the Bodhi Academy. Today we are going to discuss on the chapter Tribals, Dikus and the vision of Golden Age. Okay. So without any further delay, let's start. In 1895, a man named Birsha was seen roaming in the forest and villages of Chota Nagpur in Jharkhand. People said he had miraculous powers. He could cure all diseases and multiply grain. Birsa himself declared that God had appointed him to save his people from the trouble. So Birsa introduced himself as the messenger of God. Free them from the slavery to save his people from trouble. Free them from the slavery of the Dikus. Soon thousands began following Birsa. So who were Dikus? Outsiders. Okay. Birsa was born in a family of Mundas, a tribal group that lived in Chota Nagpur. But his followers included other tribes of the region, Santals and Oraonas. All of them, in different ways, were unhappy with the changes that they were experiencing and the problems they were facing under British rule. Their familiar ways of life seemed to be disappearing. Their livelihoods were under threat and their religion appeared to be in danger. What problems did Birsa set out to resolve? Who were the outsiders being referred to as the Ghus, and how did they enslave the people of the region? What was happening to the tribal people under the British? How did their lives change? These are some of the questions you will read in this chapter. So we will in this chapter we will get the answers of all these questions. You have read about tribal societies last year. Most of the tribes had customs and rituals that were very different from those laid down by Brahmins. These societies also did not have the sharp social divisions that were characteristics of caste societies. All those who belonged to the same tribe thought of themselves as sharing a common ties of kinship. However, this did not mean that there were no social and economic differences within tribes. How did tribal groups live? By the 19th century, tribal groups in different parts of India were involved in a variety of activities. Some were jhum cultivators. Okay. Some of them were practiced jhum cultivation. What is jhum cultivation? Mark this. That is shifting cultivation. This is done on a small patches of land, mostly in forest. The cultivators cut the treetops and allow sunlight to reach the ground and burn the vegetation on the land to clear the cultivation. They spread the ash from the firing, which contain potash, and fertilize the soil. They use the axe till here. They use the axe to cut the trees and hoe to stretch the soil in order to prepare the cultivation. They broadcast the seeds that is scattered in the seeds in field instead of plowing the land and sowing the seeds. Once the crop was ready and harvested, they moved to another field. And a field had been cultivated once left fallow for several years. What is fallow? This is very important. Shifting cultivators were found in the hilly and forested tracts of northeast and central India. The lives of these tribal people depend on free movement within forests and were being able to use the land and forest for growing their crops. That is the only way they could practice shifting cultivation. Some were hunters and gatherers. In many regions, tribal groups lived in hunting animals and gathering forest produce. They saw forest as essential for survival. The Khons were such a community living in the forest of Odisha. They regularly went out to on collective hunts and then divided the meat amongst themselves. They ate fruits and roots collected from the forest and cooked food with the oil they extracted from the seeds of sal and mahua. These are very important fill-ups. They used many forest shrubs and herbs and made for medicinal purposes and sold forest produce in local markets. The local weavers and leather workers turned to the Khons when they needed suppliers of kusum and palash flowers to color their clothes and leather. Okay. From where did these forest people get their supplies of rice and other grains? It's a big question, right? At times, they exchanged goods, getting what they needed in return for their valuable forest produce. At other times, they bought goods with the small amount of earnings they had. Some of them did odd jobs in the villages, carrying loads or building roads, while others labored in the fields, peasants and farmers. When suppliers of forest produce shrank, tribal people had to increasingly wander around in search of work as laborers, but many of them, like the Boigas of Central Asia, were reluctant to do work for others. The Boigas saw themselves, who were Boigas? A local tribe, okay? Boigas saw themselves as the people of the forest who could only live on the produce of the forest. It was below the dignity of the Boiga to become a laborer. So the Boigas did not work as laborer. Tribal groups often needed to buy and sell in order to be able to get food and that were not produced within the locality. This led to their dependence on traders and money lenders. Traders came around with things for sale and sold the goods at high prices. Money lenders gave loans with which the tribals made their cash needs, adding to what they earned. But the interest charge of the loans was unusually very high. So the tribals market and the commerce often meant debt and poverty. So money lenders and traders, they both way exploited the tribals. They therefore came to see the moneylender and treasurer as evil outsiders of the cause of their misery. Some herded animals. Many tribal groups lived in the herding and rearing of animals. They were pastoralists who moved from there with their herds of cattle or sheep according to the seasons. When the grass in one place was exhausted, they moved to another area. The Van Gujjars of Punjab hills and the Lavardis of the Andhra Pradesh were cattle herders. The Gaddis of Kulu were shepherds. The Bakarwals of Kashmir reared goats. You will read more about them in your history next year. Okay, so these are the important fill-ups. Please mark it. The Santal girl carrying wood in Bihar, 1946. Some took some took to settle cultivation. Even before the 19th century, many formed within the tribal groups had begun settling down and cultivating their fields in one place year after year instead of moving from place to place. They began to use to the plow and gradually got rights over the land they lived on. In many cases, like the Mundas of Chota Nagpur, the land belonged to the clan as a whole. All members of the clan were regarded as descendants of the original settlers who had first cleared the land. Therefore, all of them had rights on the land. Very often, some people within the clan acquired more power than others. Some became chiefs and other followers. Powerful men often rented out their land instead of cultivating it themselves. British officials saw settled tribal groups like Gonds and Santals as more civilized than hunter-gatherers or shifting cultivators. Those who lived in the forest were considered to be wild and savage. They needed to be settled and civilized. How did the colonial rule affect the tribal lives? Okay, let's discuss. The lives of tribal groups changed during the British rule. Let us see how. What happened to tribal chiefs? Before the arrival of the British in many areas, the tribal chiefs were important people. They enjoyed a certain amount of economic power and had the right to administer and control their territories. In some other places, they had their own police and decided on the local rules of land and forest management. Under British rule, the functions and powers of tribal chiefs changed considerably. They were allowed to keep their land titles over a cluster and villages and rent out lands. But they lost much of their administrative power and were forced to follow laws made by British officials in India. They also had to pay tribute to the British and discipline to the tribal groups on behalf of the British. They lost the authority they had earlier enjoyed amongst their people and were unable to fulfill the traditional functions. What happened to the shifting cultivators? The British were uncomfortable with groups who moved about and did not have a fixed home. They wanted tribal groups to settle down, become peasant cultivators. Settled peasant was easier to control and administer than people who were always on move. Okay, so when the Britishers came, it affected the life of the tribal people. Okay, so before we saw that tribal people used to do shifting cultivation. Now the Britishers wanted that people, if they settle down and they become normal peasants, it will be easy to control them than people who are always moving. Settled peasants were easier to control and administer people who were always in move. The British also wanted regular revenue source for the state, so they introduced land settlements. That is, they measured the land, defined the rights of each individual to the land, and fixed the revenue demand for the state. Some peasants were declared landowners, other tenants. As you have seen in chapter, the tenants were to pay rent and the landowner in turn paid revenue to the state. The British effort to settle Jhum cultivators were successful. Settled plough cultivation is not easy in areas where water is scarce and the soil is dry. In fact, Jhum cultivators who took to plough cultivation often suffered since their fields did not produce good yields. So the Jhum cultivators in northeast India insisted on continuing with their traditional practice. Facing widespread protest, the British had to ultimately allow them the right to carry on shifting cultivation in some parts of the forest. Forest laws and their impacts. Now, this was a very uh, significant point of this chapter, forest law. Okay. The life of tribal groups, as you have seen, was directly connected to the forest. So, changes in the forest law had a considerable effect on the tribal lives. The British extended their control over all forests and declared the forest were state property. Some forests were classified as reserve forest, so they produced timber which the British wanted. In these forests, people were not allowed to move freely, practice jhum cultivation, collect fruits, or hunt animals. How were jhum cultivators to survive in such situation? Many were therefore forced to move to other areas in search of work and livelihood. Sleeper, this is important. The horizontal planks of wood on which railway lines are laid. Okay. But once the British stopped the tribal people from living inside forest, they faced a problem. From where would the forest department get its labor to cut trees out railway sweepers and transport logs? Colonial officials came up to the solution. They decided that they would give jhum cultivators some small patches of land in the forest and allow them to cultivate these on the to provide labor to the forest department and look after the forest. So in many regions, the forest department established forest villages to ensure a regular supply of cheap labor. Many tribal groups reacted against the colonial forest laws. They disobeyed the new laws, continued with their practices that were declared illegal, and at times rose in open rebellion. Such was the revolt of Sonagram Sangama in 1906 in Assam and the forest satyagraha in 1930s in the central provinces. So, tribal people did not like the laws. Okay, they were very happy with their old livelihood. So they they were, so they did the works which were told illegal by the Britishers, and somewhere and some places they even did protest. Okay, the problem with trade during 19th century, tribal groups found that traders and money lenders were coming into forest for more often, waiting to buy forest products, offering cash loans, and asking them to work for wages. It took tribal groups some time to understand the consequences, what was happening. Okay. Let us consider the case of silk growers. In the 18th century, Indian silk was in demand in the European markets. The fine quality of Indian silk was highly valued and exports from India increased rapidly. As the market expanded, East India Company officials tried to encourage silk production to meet growing demand. Hazaribagh in present-day Jharkhand was an area where the Santals reared cocoons. The traders dealing in silk in their agents to have loans to the tribal people and collected the cocoons. The growers paid 3 to 4 rupees for 1,000 cocoons. These were then exported to Burdwan or Gaya, where they were sold at 5 times the price. The middlemen, so called because they arranged deals between the exporters and silk growers, made huge profits. The silk growers earned very little. Understandably, many tribal groups saw the market and the traders as their main enemies. The search of work. The plight of the tribals who had to go far away from their homes in search of work was even worse. From the 19th century, tea plantations started coming up and mining became an important industry. Tribals were recruited in large numbers to work in tea plantations of Assam and coal mines of Jharkhand. They were recruited through contractors who paid them miserably low wages and prevented them from returning home. A closer look. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, tribal groups in different parts of the country rebelled against the changes in the laws. The restrictions of their practices and the new taxes they had to pay, and exploitation by traders and moneylenders. The Coals rebelled in 1831 to 32, rose in revolt in 1855. The Basta rebellion in central India broke out into 1910, and the Warli revolt in Maharashtra in 1940. The movement that Birsa led was such movement. Birsa Munda. Birsa was born in mid 1870s. The son of a poor father, he grew up around the forest of Bohonda, gazing sheep, playing the flute, and dancing in local akhara. Forced by poverty, his father had to move from place to place looking for work. As an adolescent, Birsa heard tales of the Munda upsprings of the past and saw the Sirdars, the leaders of the community, urging the people to revolt. They talked of golden age. When the Mundas had been free from oppression of the Dikus, and said there would be time when the ancestral right of the community would be restored. They saw themselves as the descendants of the original settlers of the region, fighting for their land. Mulkilarai, reminding people of the need of the win back their kingdom. Birsa went to local missionary school and listed the sermons of missionaries. There too he heard it said that it was possible for the Mundas to attain the kingdom of heaven and reign their lost rights. This would be possible if they became good Christians and gave up their bad practices. Later, Birsa, who spent some time in the company of a prominent Vaishnava preacher, he owed the sacred thread and began to value the importance of purity and piety. Birsa was deeply influenced by many of the ideas came in touch with in his growing up years. His movement was aimed at reforming tribal society. He urged the Mundas to give up drinking liquor, clean their villages, and stop believing in witchcraft and sorcery. But we must remember that Birsa also turned against missionaries and landlords. He saw them as outside forces that were ruining the Munda way of life. In 1895, Birsa urged his followers to recover his glorious past. He talked of a golden age or in the past and Satyug when Mundas lived a good life, constructed embankments, tapped natural springs, planted trees and orchards, practiced cultivation to earn their living. They did not kill their brethren and relatives. They lived honestly. Birsa also wanted people to once again work on their land, settle down and cultivate their fields. What worried British officials most that was the political aim of the Birsa movement. For it wanted to drive out missionaries, moneylenders, landlords and the government and set up a Munda Raj with Birsa at its head. The movement identified all these forces as the cause of misery of Mundas were suffering. The land polities were destroying their traditional system. Landlords and moneylenders were taking over their land and missionaries were criticizing the traditional culture. As the movement spread, the British official decided to act. They arrested Birsa in 1895 and convinced him on charges of rioting and jailed him for 2 years. When Birsa was released in 1897, he began touring the villages to gather support. He used traditional symbols and language to rouse people, using them to destroy Ravana. Who were the Ravana? The Dikus. Birsa considered Ravanas to the Dikus and the Europeans, and established a kingdom under his leadership. Birsa's followers began targeting the symbols of Diku and European power. They attacked police stations and churches and raided the property of moneylenders and zamindars. They raised the white flag as a symbol of Birsa Raj. In 1900, Birsa died of cholera and the movement faded out. However, the movement was significant at last in the last least 2 years. First, it forced the colonial government to introduce laws so that the land of the tribals could not be easily taken out by Dikus. Second, it showed once again that the tribal people had the capacity to protest against injustice and express their anger against colonial rule. They did this in their own specific way, inventing their own rituals and struggle. Okay. So I hope you all understood the chapter, and for more information or details, please contact the Good